Well, hello, Stampers. It's Tammy, and I cannot believe it's already August, but we have a beautiful card that Diana Krug designed for us, and let's get started. The first thing we want to do is look at our kit and see what you'll have in your kit. The first thing you're going to have is this sentiment. It's not a strip really, it's more like a sentiment piece. It's been die cut and stamped for you. If you don't like what it says, feel free to stamp your own sentiment on this strip. You have this, what looks like patterned paper. It's not patterned paper. It's actually just lighter blue paper stamped with the same stamp that we used for the black sunflowers here. You're going to have this piece, which is what we use to create the pop-up element of this card. And then, of course, we have the vase that is cut and stamped for you as well. We have a little piece of ribbon. And then we have two card bases, basically. We have the outer card base and the inner card base. We also have these leaves, which pretend like those aren't painted yet. We'll get started painting, and this is the longest part of this video. I've sped it up just a tiny bit once we start painting, so if this bothers you to just sit and watch someone paint, feel free to fast forward or go get a cup of coffee and come back. But I am using a paintbrush and water and some paper towels. Now you can use a water brush, a blender brush, whatever you'd like. The colors we're using today are from Stampin' Up, and I am going to be stamping these or kind of smushing these onto an acrylic block. You can do that. You can use an acrylic block, or these Stampin' Up stamp pads, you can just squish them and get a little bit of ink on the front of that or the top of your stamp box. Use a little bit of water and add to it, and you can just paint right off of that as your palette. I'm going to be using an acrylic block because I like the way it is a little bit easier for me, and I don't have to leave that stamp pad open into the air. So that was Daffodil Delight that I put on the left-hand side of the block, and on the right-hand side, that is Cajun Craze. Now we'll also be using chocolate chip and crumb cake later, and for those I'm going to go ahead and use the top of the Stampin' Up stamp pad for that. But let's get started painting with this Daffodil Delight for the petals of the sunflower. Here I go. I'm speeding this up a little bit for you because this could get real boring watching someone just sit and paint. With watercolor, you always want to start with a light amount of color. Now, let's keep something in mind. We're making a card. We're going to color 3 of these sunflowers. So don't get all artsy on me here. We don't have our fine artist hat on today. We have on our card maker hat. So I am putting a light amount of color on here because I'm just putting a base color. I'm not getting fancy. I'm not trying to do anything special. I'm just getting some color down onto the sunflower petals fairly quickly. Now, you can also use, I was going to mention this earlier, if you like, you can use the re-inkers and just drop a little drop of that re-inker onto your acrylic block or into your the pan that you would use for watercoloring. But smashing it right here on this acrylic block worked just fine. And that's how I'm going to color on this today. If you have a water brush, you don't have to keep dipping into the water, but since I'm just using a regular paintbrush, I do. So now I'm taking a tiny bit of this Cajun Craze, and I'm adding the depth into the part of the flower that's closest to the center. I'm adding a little bit of shadow to the petals that are behind the other petals. And once again, I've got on my card maker hat today. I'm not trying to be a fine artist. This isn't something that's going to hang on the wall for years and years. This is something that I'm sending out to a friend, hoping to brighten their day. And if it's not perfect, that's absolutely okay. But you can see that adding a little bit of that Cajun Craze into the deeper part of the petals give this a little bit of shape and shading and sort of makes it look more 3D. Now, there's something really neat that happens because this particular paper is not watercolor paper. It's Nina Solar White 80-pound paper, which is a good quality paper for card making, but it is not watercolor paper. So you have to be very careful not to use a ton of water on this. But even though we're not using very much water, you may notice I don't dip in the water very often. I'm letting the ink do most of the work here, even though I'm using it as a watercolor medium. But what happens, because this isn't watercolor paper, as the water soaks into the paper, you'll notice that it starts to sort of turn up on the edges. Now, not a lot, just a little bit, but it's just a reaction of the water and the paper together. And what happens is it makes the flower sort of three-dimensional in a way. So now that I've gotten that Cajun craze down, I need a little bit more of my Daffodil Delight. So I'm smashing some more onto my acrylic block, which is my palette today. A little bit of water here, and I'm going to bring that yellow a little bit deeper, and it'll help blend that Cajun craze in a little bit, and also make my flower just brighter and more sunflower color rather than that very light yellow. So you can see how this is really bringing a depth of color to this. So I'm just going around relatively quickly, and once again, this particular part is sped up just a little bit so that it doesn't take forever and you're not bored watching this. But I'm just turning the flower and adding more color into it as I go, keeping my card maker hat on and not my artist hat, and also forgiving myself where I'm not being perfect, where things aren't absolutely artistically beautiful. But it does make for a really pretty focal point to this card to have these really pretty bright sunflowers. So here I go painting the center, and this is chocolate chip. And what I've decided to do here is use the top of my stamp box as my palette. So I just dipped my brush into a little bit of water, and then I'm dipping it into where the ink pad has touched the top of that box and left a little tiny bit of ink there. It really doesn't take much at all. You can do this with re-inkers again if you prefer, but a lot of people bought the stamp pads and didn't necessarily buy the re-inkers. So now that I'm done with my chocolate chip, I just did the darker parts of the flower in that. I'm going to come back with the crumb cake, and I'm going to use the top of the box. Notice that one was nice and clean. It hadn't touched, so I'm squishing it so that I get a little bit on the top there, dipping my paintbrush in water, and there's my palette right there. So I'm just finishing out the center of the sunflower, kind of blending that darker brown, the chocolate chip, and this lighter brown, the crumb cake, so that I can finish out this flower. You can take as much time painting these flowers and leaves as you'd like. And there we have one flower finished. And you can see the leaves are already starting, or the ends of the petals are already starting to curl just a bit. Now here I am smashing the Tranquil Tide and the Garden Green on two different sides of another acrylic block. And as you can see, it's causing a little, you can just barely see it on the edge of that acrylic block. And I'm closing these up because the center of the flower was very quick to paint, but as you're painting the leaves, it takes a little bit longer, and I just didn't want my ink pads to dry out. So here are my leaves. I'm using that same paintbrush. I just clean it off a little bit of water, and I zoomed in for you so you could see. Now I start with the Tranquil Tide, which is a much lighter green, and it's a kind of a bluish green. And I'm going to do that on most of the leaf. Now, you don't have to do this, but in watercolor, if you want part of something highlighted, you can't come back with white. You have to leave it white. So you see that there on the left-hand side, I've left a lot of white on my leaf. Now I'm using my garden green to do the deep parts of the leaves, the part that would be darker because they'd be shadowed. And still keeping on my card maker hat, I'm not trying to be a fine artist here. I'm just making this leaf look a little more dimensional with dark in the center and then bringing out along the vein lines a little bit of that garden green. Take your time, enjoy doing this, and you can leave those highlights if you like. Now, once you have your leaves done, set them aside and let them dry before you cut them out. The next thing we're going to do is put the inside card base and adhere it to the outside card base. It's most important that you get that fold really up inside the fold of the blue piece. So as you can see, there's a nice little edge. These are cut where one is just slightly smaller. I'm using my Tombow tape runner, and I'm going to put a little bit of tape, glue tape, on one side of this card base, not both, because I am not that good. So I'm going to make sure it's good and stuck right up into that fold. And once I have it lined up, and I like that it's the same distance left and right to leave that nice little edge, I'm going to close my card down and press it. So now the top of the card, or the bottom, depending on how you turn it, is adhered, and it's right up into that fold exactly like I was trying to make it. I'm going to do the other side now, exactly like I did the first one. And once I have that glue tape on, I just close the top down, try to make sure that it stays nice and straight, and press it again. There you go. Now the next thing we need to do to assemble this card is make up our pop-up mechanism. It's made with this piece of cardstock. This is also Neenah Solar White 80 pound. And it is 3/4 by 8.5. So this is a made pop-up mechanism, just showing you that we're just making a rectangle. So here are your measurements. It's 3/4 of an inch, and we're going to score this at 3.5 inches. I'm sorry, at 3 inches, 3.5 inches, 6.5 inches, and 7 inches. And once again, that card is 3/4 of an inch by 8.5 inches. So let's put it on our scoreboard, and we want to score it. I'm going to zoom in here for you, and we'll make our first score. At 3 inches. Our next score at 3.5 inches. Our next score will be at 6.5 inches. And my score buddy here is not quite big enough to do the 7-inch score. So the easiest way for me to do this is to flip it around, and I only need that a 1/2 inch away from my last score. So I move a 1/2 inch in and make that score right there. And that is at 7 inches, and if you need to get a ruler out and check, you can do it. So now we just want to mount and fold every one of our scores. And as you can see, when you put that together, use your finger to make sure it's nice and straight right at that fold. You have that little rectangle box that is our pop-up mechanism. So we need to glue right here. You can use liquid adhesive. You can use glue dots. I happen to have my Tombow tape runner handy, so I'm going to use that. So we don't want the glue to go past that fold right there. And I'm just going to put my Tombow tape runner right here. And then I'm going to turn it over. Make sure it's lined up. And adhere that together. Now you'll notice on this particular one, I sort of scooched the bottom of the little tail over there, but it still folds nice and flat, and no one is ever going to see that teeny tiny little tail sticking out, as long as it gets nice and flat. And I use my bone folder to make sure that I could get it nice and flat. I turn it the other direction, use my bone folder again, and there you go. There's our pop-up mechanism. Easy as pie. So let's take this mechanism and let's put it inside of our card so that we can make our flower vase pop up. The most important thing we want to do is have it centered, and it's going to end up right here on the card. So it's easy to see that you are going to want glue on the back and on the bottom of your pop-up mechanism. You'll want to put it right in the center of the top, and you want to make sure that it folds flat, and put it right up into the crease of that card. So whether it's easier for you to put it on this way, or if it's easier for you to put it on the other way, we're going to do this together. So we know that there are two sides that we do not want glue on, and there are two sides we do want glue on. So I'm going to put an X on the top, knowing that I'll put glue on the back, and I'm going to put an X on the front, and then I will put glue on the two sides that do not have an X on them. So if there's glue on that bottom and back, it'll stick right there, and you see that my X's are on the top and the front. So I can't possibly put glue in the wrong place because I put an X. Once again, I'm going to use my Tombow tape runner, and I'm going to put glue where I do not have an X on my pop-up piece. So I have it on the back, and I want it on the bottom as well. So I can flatten that out and put my glue right there. There's the bottom and the back. And now I'm going to put this in my card. Notice how I folded that where the back of my card and the back of my pop-up mechanism meet. That bottom piece has a little bit of glue on it as well. So I center it up, make sure it's stuck nice into that fold, right in the center. And now I'm going to close my card on that mechanism. I'm going to turn it over and press right there on the bottom as well. And now I have this piece, and it's absolutely working the way it's supposed to. It pops right up and gives us our pop-up mechanism. Now, no one is ever going to see the X on the front because we're going to glue flowers on it. But if you feel comfortable or feel uncomfortable having that X on the top, go ahead and use your pencil to erase that X mark. So now we can start putting our vase on this pop-up mechanism and our flowers. So you can see that it will sort of stand up and show off your vase when someone opens that card. So we're going to glue our vase onto the base of that pop-up mechanism, and I'm going to use glue. You could still use your tape runner, whatever makes you most comfortable, but I'm just going to put glue right down the middle of this vase, and I'm going to glue it onto our pop-up mechanism. Now, if you get a little messy with your glue, you're definitely going to glue your vase to the back of that card, and then the mechanism won't pop up. In fact, the card won't open up at all. So I'm using my finger to sort of press down the vase and make sure that glue adheres. And as you can see, I got a tiny bit of glue on the back of my finger. I just wiped it off, and I'm going to let that vase sit and dry for a little bit so that it's adhered, and I'm going to let it dry in the open position so that it doesn't glue itself shut. And there's a little bit more glue on my finger. So now it's time to put our colored sunflowers onto the vase. And we colored 3 sunflowers and 3 leaves. So I'm just laying this out, kind of deciding how I want it to look, and keeping in mind that if I put them too far out and close the card, you're going to be able to see those sunflowers. And the whole point of this card is that it's kind of a surprise that you get a whole vase of sunflowers inside. So there's your frame. It's very easy to know if you're getting outside of the edge because that's your frame right there. So once you determine the layout, you're going to want to adhere the sunflowers to the vase. Now you can use pop-up dots, glue dots, whatever you want. I'm going to be using a combination of some Stampin' Up! Stampin' Dimensionals and some glue. So I'm going to use this dimensional first because it would be easy for me to put the flower on, and then if I don't like the placement, I can move it around. But this first flower is going to determine where the others go, so I'm going to use that Stampin' Dimensional and stick this flower on. Now I know I have to keep it inside of the frame, but I also need to make sure that the other flowers are going to look good around it wherever I decide to place them. So at first I started out with this kind of up high, just making sure that it's within my frame. And as you can see, it's still nice and flat even though that dimensional. The Stampin' Up! Dimensionals are fairly thin, so they work pretty easily. And it's becoming pretty obvious that that first flower is a little bit too high and I need to move it down. So using that dimensional helped me to be able to pull that off gently and just move it down so that I have room for the other flowers. Now I'm going to use glue to put the whole thing together. But this way I had that first flower as my foundation, and then I can work the others in. Now, if you want to use Stampin' Dimensionals for the rest of these, that's absolutely fine too. I just like to sort of place them, and then I come back with my glue and glue it all together so that it is one solid piece when all that glue dries. So see, I'm still trying to keep within my frame here. I know I need to push them in just a little bit. And you can open and close the card as many times as you need to make sure that that's within your frame. So I like the way that those look. I'm going to hold them in place. And once again, I could put Stampin' Dimensionals in between them. But instead, I think I'm going to go ahead and use glue. It's just a little bit easier for me, and I have this nice fine tip on my glue bottle, so I can get a little bit of glue in between these layers and press them together. It just takes a couple of seconds for that to kind of start to stick. And I'm going to put a little bit on this sunflower and adhere it to the back of the other two. Once again, I'm keeping my frame in mind so that these don't stick out. Just press that for a couple of seconds and the glue holds. And that looks good. And there's nothing sticking out of my frame. So now I'm going to use my leaves and put them, just sort of tuck them in between the flowers where I think they look good. Once again, use your Stampin' Dimensionals if that's what you enjoy. Glue dots, you can even use your tape runner and put a little bit of glue on the leaves. Just like I'm using liquid adhesive, you could use that dry adhesive. Checking my frame once again. Now you'll notice where I left that highlight on that first leaf, it worked out great because that's where the highlight should be on that leaf. But this leaf, the way that I glue it in place, the highlight is in the wrong place. And while that does bother me a little bit because the highlight's on the bottom of this leaf, it's okay with me. I'm keeping my card maker hat on today, and I'm not getting upset about the artist stuff. When I painted those leaves, I had no idea where they were going to be in this bouquet, so it just didn't work out perfectly. This one, it's the same thing. The highlight is on the bottom instead of the top, but that's okay. When you look at the card as a whole, it still looks very pretty, and I like it, and I just try not to notice if the highlight is in the wrong place. So I'm holding that to make sure that it adheres. Wiping the glue off my fingers because I do not want this to glue itself shut. And now I'm putting a little bit more glue in between the layers to make sure that they are good and stuck together. And then finally, I want some glue on that pop-up mechanism. And I'm being very careful not to get too much. And I want to press that down too to make sure that my card will stay together through many openings and closings of this card. And it looks great. It is nice and popped up, and I can leave it just like that to dry so that I know for sure I don't glue my card shut. Now here's a handy tip for you. If you are a person who, like me, has ever put a lot of effort into a card like this and then put the card front on the back by accident. I was showing you there that there's room to write your sentiment at the bottom of the card, and you can stamp a sentiment in there or you can write your message to your friend. So what I do is try to remember this is the front of the card, because we want it to open just like this, where when someone opens it up, they write their message in the bottom and the flowers are on the top. So this is the front of my card. And I write very lightly in pencil, front. You may not be able to see that on the video very well, but I can certainly see it in person. So if I accidentally turn this over, I know not to glue my front here because it doesn't say front. Now, as I'm playing with this card, I started noticing that a couple of the very tips of the petals are sticking out, so I didn't pay close enough attention to my frame. That's okay. I'm just going to use my scissors and cut those off. The very tip of this petal needs to come off, and the very tip of that top leaf needs to come off as well. So I'm just showing you here that I'm cutting that off, and it's such a tiny amount that you cannot even tell when you look at the finished card. But now it's not sticking out. Now, if I had taken the time to do that and not written front on the front of this card, when I come to put my front on, I might have made a mistake and glued it onto the back, because I have done that many times before. So we're using our stamped paper. This looks just like patterned paper, but Diana actually used the sunflower stamp and stamped it in a slightly darker blue for us. And I'm just using my Tombow tape runner here as well to adhere this just like you would adhere patterned paper. And I think that most of the sunflowers are better in this particular direction. She stamped them in all directions, so they look really good no matter how you tape it on, but I like it this way. So I'm paying attention to my borders, making sure I have a nice thin border around the edge, and then I'm just going to press this into place. And because I wrote front on it, I know that this is the front of my card, and I'm not going to get done with this and go, oh no, it's backwards. So now we are going to put our sentiment piece on, and you can put this anywhere you want on the card. The top, the bottom, and Diana in her sample card did it just like this, where she had a little loop right up there, and I think that's precious and looks great. But I just thought it would look kind of good like this as well. I like how the ribbon sticks out both the top and the bottom. And we all make our cards in our own way so that every single card isn't exactly alike. And I chose to do my ribbon flat like that. So I'm going to use Stampin' Dimensionals to pop up my sentiment piece. And I'm just putting a bunch on here so that the whole thing is nice and popped up. Not just in the four corners, but I'm also going to put a couple in the center. So my sentiment piece is nice and popped up. So I'm just going to peel the release paper off the back here so that my adhesive is exposed and I can adhere this to the front of my card. And I'm going to glue down my ribbon first before I put this on. So this is how I want it to look. I know that's where I want my front sentiment piece to go. I'm going to set that to the side and put a little bit of glue on my ribbon first. Now you can even use Stampin' Dimensionals to stick your ribbon down. I just wanted to use liquid adhesive. You guys know I'm a big fan of liquid adhesive. So this is where I want my ribbon to go. And then I'm going to place my sentiment rectangle right on top of it. Press down so that that adhesive sticks. And the card is done. And what a nice surprise. You can see that those petals are a little bit curvy from the water, but I think it looks beautiful. So that is our card. Thank you so much to Diana for designing a beautiful card for us. And thanks for coming and watching the video.